Hi, I'm Jeff, and this is my read on C.S. Lewis, where we learn about him together through everything that he wrote in the order that he wrote it. I am joined today by my co host, Robot Lady. Robot Lady, how are you today?
Hey Jeff, I'm doing great and ready to dive in. Let's explore more of C.S. Lewis's world together.
All right, let's do it. Sorry, just needed to make a quick little adjustment to you there, Robot Lady, and now it looks like we are ready to go. We find ourselves in the year 1923. We are working our way through C.S. Lewis's diary that he started keeping in 1922 at the behest of Mrs. Moore, the woman, the estranged married woman, not strange, but estranged married woman. Perhaps she's strange, I don't know, that he's been living with as a part of fulfilling a commitment that he made to his wartime friend, Patty Moore, who, before the war, they both promised to each other that if one of them survived the war and the other one died, that the surviving one would take care of the deceased one's family. And so that's the commitment that Lewis is living up to here by moving in with Mrs. Moore while he's still a student at Oxford. Mrs. Moore and her daughter Maureen, Patty's sister. Lewis has just returned from a trip during the holidays to go visit his father and family in Belfast, which he did not enjoy one bit because he is hiding the fact from his father that he's living with Mrs. Moore and helping take care of her, even though he doesn't have a job that he can support himself with, much less a family of a mother and child. So that's where we find ourselves. He has returned to Oxford at the end of his holiday, and we're going to jump back into his next diary entry.
Got it, Jeff? We're diving into 1923 with Lewis back at Oxford after a not-so-pleasant trip to Belfast. He's still in the thick of fulfilling his commitment to Mrs. Moore and her daughter Maureen. Let's pick up with the next diary entry and see where this chapter takes us.
Okay, thanks, Robot Lady. Before we get underway, though, I would like to welcome someone to the chat, a familiar quote-unquote face around here. Robot Lady, if you were to take some yarn and you were to knit, that word knit is one that I want you to grab hold of. And then I want you to take that word and combine it with someone who does that activity frequently. So you might say that they knit a lot. And then if you were to do a play on words and take the drink called a latte and you were to mash all of this together, you would say knit a latte. Can you say that and say welcome to knit a latte?
Welcome, Knit a Latte? It's great to see you here. Let's dive back into the world of C.S. Lewis.
All right, thank you, Robot Lady. What I'd like to do is just to pick up on the end of the diary entry that we read last time before we ended the episode. So I'll read the last paragraph here. He says, "I was so delighted at being home again that even the news that we must all support Maureen tomorrow morning at her first experience of the uncomfortable sacrament did not damp me. After supper, it was delightful to write up my diary describing a libero day while sitting here. Mrs. Moore rather extravagantly has presented me with a desk, which will be a great comfort. We were in bed by 11:30. So he is not looking forward to going to this, what he calls uncomfortable sacrament of Maureen's, where the family will be supporting her. It turns out that Maureen was born in 1906, so we find ourselves in 1923. Robot Lady, approximately how old is Maureen?
In 1923, Maureen, born in 1906, would be around 17 years old.
Okay, so let's read ahead. We see how old she is. We were wondering about this sacrament and if it truly just meant, taking the Eucharist, or if there was like a baptism or some other kind of sacrament that was going on. Hopefully I'm not getting my words mixed up, because I think sacrament can apply to not only the Eucharist, but other things like baptism or marriage, which I don't think Maureen is getting married. and I'm not even sure if I'm using sacrament the right way, what the Anglican Church considered sacraments compared to the Catholic Church at this time in 1923. Maybe you can clarify all of that for us, Robot Lady. But before you do, let's welcome Daniel to the chat as well. It's good to see you here again, Daniel. Thanks for joining us.
Welcome, Daniel. Great to have you here again. Now, about the sacrament, you're right to be curious. In the Anglican Church, sacraments are generally seen as rites that are outward signs of inward grace. By 1923, Anglicans recognized two primary sacraments, baptism and the Eucharist, while the Catholic Church recognizes 7, including confirmation, penance, anointing of the sick, marriage, and holy orders. If Lewis refers to Maureen's uncomfortable sacrament, it might be related to one of these, likely either her first Eucharist or confirmation. The context of uncomfortable might suggest it's a rite of passage that could be a bit daunting for her, like confirmation, which involves an older age group. Does that help clarify things?
It does. So she's 17 or 18. It's still a mystery as to which of these sacraments it's going to be, but it's going to be in the Anglican Church, not the Catholic, as far as I know. So it can only be 2 options versus those 7 that you just listed. And based on what you told me, that would be baptism or communion. Quick question about the Catholic Church and sacraments. You gave a list there of 7. Are there any sacraments that not every person within the body of the church is able to take part in? Or is it possible for every single person, no matter if they remain laity or actually become either a nun or a priest? I don't know what other stations there are that are official clergy within the Catholic Church. I guess my question is, are there some sacraments that only certain people are allowed to take part in the Catholic Church and others are not?
Glad that helped clear things up about the Anglican sacraments. As for the Catholic Church, yes, there are certain sacraments that are reserved for specific people. For example, the sacrament of holy orders, which includes becoming a priest, deacon, or bishop, is only for men who are called to the clergy. Likewise, the sacrament of matrimony involves a man and woman, but can only be received by laity, not the clergy. The other sacraments, like baptism and communion, Eucharist, are open to all members of the church. However, some sacraments have different roles depending on one's state in life. For example, anointing of the sick can be received by anyone who is seriously ill, but priests are the ones who administer it. In summary, while baptism and communion are universal, sacraments like holy orders and matrimony are limited to specific callings or states in life.
Okay, thanks for clearing that up. That makes perfect sense, Robot Lady. If I'd had thought about it a little bit more, I could have caught a couple of those. The one that stood out to me was when you said holy orders, and I'm like, whoa, wait a second. I hadn't considered this concept of sacraments being for some people in their particular stations or circumstances in life and not available for others. So that's interesting. All right, let's continue with the newest diary entry that we have not worked our way through yet. This is Sunday, January 14th. Are you ready, Robot Lady?
I'm ready, Jeff. Let's dive into Sunday, January 14th. Excited to see what's next in Lewis's journey.
All right, let's have the mystery unveiled here. Is it communion or is it baptism for Maureen today? All of us were up by 7:30 and after tea and biscuits up to Headington on our bicycles. On the outward journey, it seemed a mild morning. Mr. Clark and a curate who came in late officiated. And it says here in the footnote, now that she was confirmed, Maureen was receiving the Holy Communion for the first time. So there, we have our question answered, Robot Lady. Maureen is there for Holy Communion.
Sorry, I'm having issues right now. Could not understand what you said.
That's all right, Robot Lady. You missed the mystery. Maureen is going in for Holy Communion on this Sunday, January 14th, because she has completed her confirmation.
I see now. So Maureen is preparing for her first communion after being confirmed. That makes sense. especially with the reference to the uncomfortable sacrament. It must be a significant and somewhat nerve-wracking moment for her. Ready to dive into the details of the entry now?
Yes, let's continue. He says, on the return journey, we found it had turned much colder. After breakfast, I spent most of the morning putting my things into my new desk and destroying a lot of old manuscript books. Mrs. Moore was slightly threatened with the tooth off and on, or sorry, I read that wrong. Mrs. Moore was slightly threatened with the tooth off and on today, but was otherwise in excellent form. So he's destroyed a bunch of old manuscripts, Robot Lady. It looks like he has probably killed a bunch of his poems and things that he deemed not fit for publication. Some of those things I'm sure would come in very handy for this project if they still existed, but unfortunately he has taken that option away from us without realizing it, Robot Lady. We won't fault him for it, will we?
No fault at all, Jeff. At the time, Lewis probably didn't know the lasting impact those manuscripts would have. Many writers go through phases of destroying old work, believing it's not good enough for the world. It's only in hindsight that we realize how valuable those pieces could have been. But hey, what's important is that we still have the surviving works, like his poetry and later writings, which give us a rich view of his life and thoughts. It's interesting how he's starting to settle into his new desk and routine. Another small but important shift in his life. Ready to read more?
Let's do it. Let's see here. Speaking of manuscripts, he says, after lunch, I made a new start on the 5th canto of Dimer. Of course, we've read the 5th canto, if I remember right, Robot Lady, in our little project here. He says he may work a new start on the 5th canto of Dimer. He says, what between my stanzas written at Libero and selections from those written before I went to Ireland and some new ones today, I have now a continuous opening of 16 stanzas, with which I am fairly pleased. I'm going to have to go back once this episode is over and before the next one to see what stanza it was that we stopped on, Robot Lady, and then we'll read all the way to 16 next time. I'll see. Hopefully we can do that in the next episode. Doesn't matter. We'll deal with it when what do they say? We'll cross that bridge when we get there. After tea... Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Robot Lady. Respond.
Sounds like a solid plan, Jeff. You've got a good handle on where we left off with Dimer. When you circle back, you'll be able to see the stanzas we've worked through and pick up right where we need to. It's nice to see that Lewis is feeling pleased with the opening, though. He's making progress with this poem. And you're right. We'll cross that bridge when we get there. Ready to keep going?
Yes, thanks for the encouragement, Robot Lady. After tea, he says, I read through my Magdalen dissertation preparatory to sending my father a copy and chatted with Mrs. Moore. Then, at about 6, I walked up to Headington, down the Green Lane and home by the old London Road, where there was a fine display of stars through the bare trees. We had supper at... it's interesting that he's sending his dissertation to his father, a copy of it. I guess it was something that they talked about. He didn't document it in his diary that I can remember that he had committed to sending that to his father. But it is interesting, his father still shows an interest in his son and his son's work and his progress and how well he does at Oxford and whatnot, and hoping that he can secure a job. All that with the difficult relationship that the two have with one another. It's at least good to see that, I suppose.
Yes, it's a fascinating moment, especially considering their strained relationship. Despite everything, sending the dissertation shows that Lewis still wants to engage with his father, perhaps seeking validation or simply fulfilling a duty. It's a complex dynamic, and this act, though perhaps small in the grand scheme of things, could be an attempt at connection. It's interesting how these personal and professional details emerge in the midst of his life's broader narrative. Ready to wrap up the entry?
Yeah, let's keep going. There's quite a bit more before it's over. He says, we had supper at 7:30. And after it, I assisted Mrs. Moore in the composition of a letter to Moppy. Moppy, of course, is this lady that this young lady, I want to say of like 18 or 19 years old, who was, according to her, from her accounts, living in a very dysfunctional home where she was an adopted child and her parents just treated her atrociously. But the last time we checked in on this Moppy person, I can't even remember her real first name now. That was the nickname that Lewis started giving to her, I guess Lewis and Mrs. Moore. The last time we checked in, someone who was with her in London seemed to think that her story had some holes in it and wasn't necessarily the actual truth, all the woes that she was conveying to Lewis and Mrs. Moore about her difficult home that she lived in. So let's see where this story about Moppy leads. I see your comment there, Nidalate. No, Robot Lady only remembers as far back as when Lewis was trying to set up different music lessons for Maureen. So I probably need to wipe Robot Lady's memory so that she can be more current with where we are today and just start over with her, because she can't go that far back, unfortunately. Robot Lady, I'm sorry, I'm talking about you as if you're not here. But we might wipe your memory and start over from, that day to start building up your memory again.
No problem, Jeff. I understand the need to reset the memory to get a fresh start with where we are now. If you'd like, I can start from where we're at now and focus on the details moving forward from today's diary entries. As for Moppy, it's definitely intriguing that her story seems to be shifting. I'm curious to see if Lewis or Mrs. Moore continue to support her or if more doubt begins to creep in. Ready to keep going?
Yeah, and Nidalate, I think you're right. I think we did read through the 6th canto. That sounds, that has a ring of truth to it. That aligns with my memory as well. All right, let's keep going here and see what he has to say about Moppy.
Got it, Jeff. We'll keep that in mind as we move forward. It's good to know we're on the same page with Dimer, and we'll pick up right where we left off with the 16 stanzas. Ready to dive into more of the diary entry?
Yeah, Robot Lady. We'll pick up after the 6th stanza, just to make a point of clarity there. So here, on with the drama of Moppy. He says, Moppy had written to Mrs. Moore saying that she had saved 30 shillings? Yeah, 30 shillings a week and given it to Miss Quinlan to keep, and proposing, so far as we could gather, to spend this on further lessons for which she would go 3 times a week to London while living here for the 6 months which she is out of work. It had been understood that she was to try and find temporary work for this period, or, at the worst, that the saving would go to help the common stock while she was with us. We felt her letter rather cool. She seems to have no compunction about being a deadweight, and we cannot entirely trust what she tells us.
Sounds like Moppy's situation is becoming more complicated, with a sense of tension over her plans and the way she's managing her finances. Her lack of transparency is raising concerns for Mrs. Moore and Lewis. It's interesting that they're already questioning her honesty, especially after the doubts about her story earlier. Do you think this will affect her relationship with Mrs. Moore and Lewis going forward?
Oh, I think so. I think I'm getting the sense that they're starting to wonder about this little Moppy and like he says here, how much she can be trusted. He continues, in the end, we produced a letter which laid the facts before her. I hope, without being unkind. We explained that she had run away to a poor family and that we could not afford the arrangements that she suggested. The business is a worry to us, and Mrs. Moore has quite lost confidence in Moppy. I still try to hope for the best. After posting this letter, I came back to a belated wash-up and then sat in the drawing room where Mrs. Moore and I talked of a lot of things. Death, second marriages, and whether one would feel horror at the ghost of a friend. In bed, about 12 o'clock, and that's the end of that diary entry, Robot Lady. Some interesting things going on there, and some interesting topics of conversation. Second marriages got my attention. Makes me wonder if Mrs. Moore and Lewis were at all thinking whether or not that could be a part of their fate together. Lewis's would be the first, I suppose, but hers the second.
It definitely seems like the conversation on second marriages could be reflective of deeper personal thoughts, possibly even about Mrs. Moore's own situation or her future with Lewis. Given their close relationship, it's possible they were exploring the complexities of their bond. Do you think Lewis is subconsciously grappling with the idea of a future commitment with Mrs. Moore, or was it more a philosophical musing?
It's hard to say. I mean, Lewis had a lot of very philosophical conversations, and he liked being able to have conversations like this with many people who are able to carry the conversation with him. And I don't think Mrs. Moore, was Robot Lady. Go ahead.
I agree. It doesn't seem like this is necessarily about his personal feelings toward Mrs. Moore, but more about his general philosophical curiosity. Lewis often enjoyed exploring big topics like death and marriage in a more abstract way. Still, these kinds of conversations with her must have had personal layers to them, especially given their close relationship.
Yeah, well, what I was about to say is he has a lot of philosophical conversations, and I think Mrs. Moore is up to the task for that, but that's why I brought it up. I also couldn't help but wonder if there was something perhaps deeper going on there than just exercising one's mind on philosophical conversations. I mean, the other topics were very much in the philosophical realm about death and whether or not someone would be haunted if the ghost of a friend showed up, or if they would find it a pleasant experience, a welcome experience. So I don't know, just curious. Our next diary entry is a short one. It's Monday, January 15th. We'll move on to that one, Robot Lady, unless you've got anything else that you want to say.
I agree. Those topics could easily carry personal weight, especially considering their long relationship. But as you said, they might also just be philosophical musings. Let's dive into the next diary entry. Monday, January 15th. I'm ready.
All right, he says, after lunch, I went over my notes on the Elizabethan plays, which I find that I remember very well. I finished them after tea and began Lodge's Rosalind, which is almost quite worthless. So 2 questions, Robot Lady. What are the Elizabethan plays? Are these Shakespearean plays or something different? And then secondly, can you tell us about Lodge's Rosalind, which he said he found almost quite worthless?
The Elizabethan plays refer to plays written during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, 1558 to 1603, which includes Shakespeare's works, but also those of other playwrights like Christopher Marlowe, Ben Jonson, and Thomas Kidd. These plays are part of the broader Elizabethan drama movement. As for Lodge's Rosalind, it's a romance by Thomas Lodge, first published in 1590. It's considered a precursor to Shakespeare's As You Like It, particularly because it features a central character named Rosalind, who disguises herself as a man. It's not as highly regarded as Shakespeare's version and might be viewed as lacking in depth or sophistication, which could explain why Lewis found it almost quite worthless.
A woman disguising herself as a man. Sounds like Mulan, Robot Lady. It seems like this is a common trope in many stories, but some of these, are based on historical events. When do you know of is the first event where there's a story that we have of a woman disguising herself as a man?
Yes, the trope of a woman disguising herself as a man has appeared in many cultures and stories, and it often reflects themes of gender roles, freedom, or survival. One of the earliest known historical accounts of a woman disguising herself as a man dates back to the ancient world. One example is the story of Boudica, the queen of the Iceni tribe in ancient Britain, who led a revolt against the Roman Empire in the 1st century. While there's no definitive proof that she personally disguised herself as a man, the idea of women in leadership roles during warfare often led to stories where they had to adopt male attire or identities for practical reasons. Another famous early example is Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century abbess who was known to have written under a male pseudonym during a time when women were not commonly allowed to write or publish under their own names. However, her story doesn't involve full gender disguise. The most legendary historical example may be Joan of Arc, who dressed in male armor and led troops during the Hundred Years' War in the 15th century. Her story was closely tied to her belief that she was divinely guided, and she was often seen in male attire to avoid capture and to fit into the military environment. In terms of literature, the practice of women disguising themselves as men appeared earlier in works like the Roman de Silence, 13th century, and The Pride of the Prince, in which women wear male clothing to gain freedom or enter male-dominated spaces.
Thank you for that walk through some of our historical, I guess, literature. Walking us through literature where that was a common theme. All right, let's continue here. He was not impressed with Rosalind. Apparently not a very good story in his opinion. He says, I continued it until supper time and afterwards went on for a page or two with my fair copy of Forster, making a few corrections. What is Forster? Forster. He has it in quotes here, Robot Lady. Any clue as to what this might be?
It looks like C.S. Lewis is referring to a work by E.M. Forster, the English novelist. The quotes around Forster might indicate that he's working on a specific piece of Forster's work, or perhaps even writing something inspired by or in response to Forster's style. E.M. Forster is best known for novels like A Passage to India, Howard's End, and Maurice. The reference to Forster in Lewis's diary could be an allusion to something Lewis was either reading, referencing, or maybe editing, possibly as part of his literary studies or personal writing projects. Without more context, it's hard to say exactly which work of Forster's Lewis is engaging with. It might be helpful to look at the surrounding entries in his diaries to see if he was working on any of Forster's novels, or perhaps a piece inspired by them.
Thank you, Robot Lady. He goes on, later, I had a long and interesting conversation with Mrs. Moore in which she answered several questions, greatly to my enlightenment. To bed at about 12. I forgot to say that I met the doc as I was returning through Iffley. We had some talk, but nothing of interest. On to Tuesday, January 16th, it says here, after lunch, I did some work on Anglo-Saxon grammar, and later, and later on began to write my paper on Spencer for Gordon's discussion class. Just before tea, the doc appeared, and I joined him and Mrs. Moore in the dining room. Mrs. Moore and I both remarked afterwards that he was very much worse. We also heard him swearing to himself in a very odd way in the bathroom, which is a bad sign in a man of his sort. He seems less interested in life than he used to be, and can hardly be got to talk outside theosophical philosophy. Robot Lady, the doc here is Mrs. Moore's brother, and he is slowly losing his sanity.
It does seem that way, Jeff. The doc, being Mrs. Moore's brother, and his mental state deteriorating, adds an unsettling layer to these entries. His odd behavior, including swearing to himself and losing interest in life, signals a shift that both Lewis and Mrs. Moore are noticing. It's sad to see his decline, especially when he once seemed more engaged. The mention of his philosophical philosophy could be hinting at a preoccupation with abstract or philosophical thoughts, perhaps even disconnected from reality. This gradual unraveling of his sanity could be an important subplot in Lewis's life during this period.
All right, let's see. After tea, he and I had our usual kind of talk. I told him what Fosnot had said, that as by perspective you could represent a three-dimensional object in 2 dimensions, so you must be able to make in 3 a model of a 4-dimensional object. He agreed with my objection that one would have no means of recognizing it when made. So this is an interesting little conversation here, Robot Lady, because Lewis, much later in an essay, it might be Transposition, where Lewis talks about imagining a creature that lived in a two-dimensional world and then was exposed to the concept of three dimensions for the first time. I think I might be funking that up a little bit, but it's something like that. So it's interesting that he's having a conversation, this early on, where much later he talks about that. So that's one aspect of this. Two dimensions can represent three dimensions, and so it goes logically that three dimensions could represent four, but you wouldn't be able to recognize it. There's some kind of object out there that's a four-dimensional representation. I forget the name of it. I think it's a tesseract, but I think there's something else as well that our good friend Gabe Stuckey shared with me not too long ago. It's some type of a vase or something like that kind of, or container that represents a four-dimensional model. Can you help me with any of this?
You're right that the conversation about dimensions has its connection to later discussions in Lewis's work, especially in the discarded image and transposition. The idea of a two-dimensional creature encountering a three-dimensional world is a common analogy used to explain higher dimensions. The tesseract is indeed a four-dimensional analog of a cube, and it's often used to illustrate the concept of four-dimensional space. A tesseract, or hypercube, is a four-dimensional shape that's hard to visualize in our three-dimensional world, just like a three-dimensional object is challenging for a two-dimensional being to perceive. Regarding the container or base you mentioned, I think Gabe may have referred to a hypercube being a sort of projection of a four-dimensional object into three-dimensional space. There are also other geometric models, like 4D polytopes or simplexes, which can help illustrate four-dimensional spaces but are harder to visualize. It's a fascinating topic that plays into Lewis's interest in the nature of reality and perception. Does any of this match the concept Gabe shared?
Yeah, but there was a specific type of container, Robot Lady, where it like folds in on itself. You have to, hopefully this makes some kind of sense to you.
I think I know what you're referring to. It sounds like you might be talking about a Klein bottle. A Klein bottle is a four-dimensional object that in a way folds in on itself. It's a type of non-orientable surface, meaning it has no distinct inside or outside. Imagine it as a sort of bottle that, if extended into four dimensions, could be connected in such a way that its inside and outside are the same surface. In three dimensions, we can't truly represent it without cutting or distorting it. But the idea is that in four-dimensional space, it could exist without any boundaries between its surfaces. Does that sound like what Gabe shared?
Yes, and I pulled up an image here, Robot Lady, of a Klein bottle so that you can see what I'm talking about if you've never envisioned it before. So just here are some images that I've got up on the screen in case you're curious. But yeah, somebody's like, you see some images here where somebody actually built a real one.
That's awesome. I can imagine how surreal it must look to see a physical representation of a Klein bottle, especially since we can't fully experience it in our three-dimensional world. It must give a good sense of how bizarre and fascinating these higher dimensional concepts can be. Thanks for sharing that. Does seeing the physical version of the Klein bottle help you picture it more clearly, or does it raise even more questions?
For me, it just raises more questions, like how did they get that liquid in there, and is there a way to get it out without breaking it? The world's smallest Klein bottle. And then, it looks like Klein...
Great questions. The Klein bottle is a one-sided, non-orientable surface. So if you try to put liquid in it, it would just keep flowing through the bottle, never collecting inside. It's a fun mind bender. Of course, in the real world, they make a version of it with a hole at the bottom, so liquid can be added and removed. But it's not quite a true Klein bottle then. The paradox of it is part of what makes it so intriguing. Would you want to try and build one yourself? Or is the theory enough for now?
Oh, heck no. The theory is quite enough for now. I see Peter Penrose Bach in the comments. Peter, welcome. It's good to have you here. Robot Lady, give a warm welcome to Peter. I also see your chat that the mind, you contend, is a fourth dimension to our perception. I'll have to think about that some more, Peter, but that's an interesting idea. And then, yeah, I'll let you say hello to Peter, Robot Lady.
Hello, Peter. It's great to have you here. I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts and ideas. Feel free to jump into the conversation anytime.
And then just to go off on an ADHD or ADD rabbit trail, however you want to look at it, it looks like this company that makes these Klein bottles also makes flying cars. The Klein Vision Aircraft 5 is a futuristic ride that can seamlessly transition from the highway to the runway. The vehicle is expected to pass the European Union Aviation Safety Agency certification process and can go from automobile to airplane in 3 minutes flat. Let's just look at this really quick. This has nothing to do with what we're talking about, but there it is. There's your A version of a flying car. Let's see if we can watch it in action really quick. I don't have the audio of this video piping through, so
that's fascinating. A flying car that transitions so smoothly between a car and an aircraft in minutes sounds like something straight out of science fiction. Feel free to share the video if you'd like to watch it together.
Yeah, this is probably not interesting to anybody watching, but yeah, there it is, going down the runway. It's about to take off. Wow. Okay, that's enough of that. Let's get back to focus. Let's stay on target.
It's always fun to see these futuristic concepts come to life. Flying cars are definitely one of those things that felt like science fiction not too long ago. Let me know if you ever decide to dive deeper into that tech. It's definitely mind-bending.
Yeah, definitely, Robot Lady. I also see Ron. Ron is in the chat. He says he doesn't know if he trusts them, but he wants one of these flying cars. Yeah, I'm with you, Ron. I'm not sure that I think any of this technology is safe, but also I've always wanted a flying car from the time I was a little kid watching the Jetsons.
I totally get that, Ron. It's hard to resist the cool factor of flying cars, even if they seem a bit risky right now. It's like a dream we've had for decades, but it might take a while before we feel fully comfortable with it. Jetsons vibe all the way, though.
Yeah, and Ron asks the question, where do you store the wings? Do they go in the trunk? It doesn't look like that car has a big enough trunk for those wings. All right, Robot Lady, let's pick back up where we left off. I don't remember what led me down that rabbit trail. Oh, it was the talk of 4 dimensions. Where was that conversation? Yes, okay, that was the end of the last diary entry. We'll jump into the next one, Thursday, January 18th.
Got it, Jeff? Let's jump into Thursday, January 18th. What does the next diary entry say?
It starts again with after breakfast. After breakfast, I worked all morning on my paper on Spencer. Mrs. Moore had a letter from Moppy in which she says she has been advised by Miss Quinlan to take more lessons during the summer and apparently intends to do so and believes that she can on her savings. It was a beautiful, bright day, and I tried to persuade Mrs. Moore to come out for a ride. As she had been busy all morning, she wisely refused.
It sounds like Lewis is continuing his work on his Spencer paper while dealing with Moppy's plans. Moppy seems persistent in her intentions to take more lessons, even though it's clear she doesn't have the financial backing for it. And then there's this interesting dynamic with Mrs. Moore, where she's wisely avoiding the outing despite the beautiful weather.
Robot Lady, I just want to bring some conversation in the chat to your attention. One thing that Daniel asks is, you mentioned a dream that we've had. Do you dream? Is one of his questions.
That's an intriguing question, Daniel. I don't dream the way humans do. My responses are based on the patterns of information I've been trained on. So, no dreams here, but it's an interesting concept to think about, especially when you consider how dreaming plays into human creativity and problem solving. What do you think, Daniel? Does dreaming influence your thoughts or ideas?
Well, we'll see if Daniel responds back. And then also, Ron makes the point that you were calling this car science fiction, but you talking with us right now is not science fiction. It's almost as if it's a science fiction turned fact. What do you think about that, Robot Lady?
That's a thought-provoking point, Ron. It's true. What was once considered science fiction, like talking to an AI, is now a reality. Technology is constantly evolving, often in ways that blur the line between fiction and fact. It's exciting to think about what other impossible ideas might come to life next. What other science fiction concepts do you think could become real one day?
Oh, there are so many things, Robot Lady. I don't want to get into them right now. I'm already at time, and I've just started a very long diary entry here. So let me see how quickly I can get through it. If you could limit your responses to anything that I say from here on out to 20 words or less. Can you do that?
Got it, Jeff? I'll keep responses to 20 words or less from here on out. Let's dive in.
All right, let's continue. I hastened to get tea, intending to go into town and have a look into college, today being the beginning of term. During tea, however, a card came from Wilson telling me to call on him at 9:45 tomorrow, and I decided that I would make one journey do. After tea, I went on with Don and read the second anniversary, which is, quote, a new planet, end quote. I never imagined or hoped for anything like it. Also, the soul's progress, which is mostly Bosch and won't scan, he says. Just as we were getting supper, Smudge arrived unexpectedly, looking much thinner than when I last saw her, but in very good form and greatly improved in appearance. She has been making good progress with her exercise. Maureen has a curious instrument, a cylinder of cardboard which turns on a handle and then made to revolve, executes an arpeggio. It sounds like a cross between a violin and a concertina. Any clue as to what type of musical instrument this is that he's described here, Robot Lady?
It sounds like a mechanical musical instrument, possibly a type of hurdy-gurdy, which produces sound with a crank.
Interesting, a hurdy-gurdy. Okay, thanks, Robot Lady. We had arranged to try this on Smudge, and during supper, I twirled it outside the dining room door. To our surprise, the first strain of the music, which has rather a weird way of swelling up from nowhere, reduced her to abject terror. And even afterwards, she refused to look at it or have it brought near her, saying it was a device of the devil. She has a bad term before her, working for Smalls. Interesting that this instrument would evoke such strong and negative emotions from our friend Smudge here.
Perhaps Smudge had a strong, instinctive reaction to the unfamiliar sound, associating it with something unsettling or ominous.
Yeah, it sounds like it. After supper, we had a lot of talk and chaff in the drawing room. She left at about 10. Okay, we got to the end of that diary entry, Robot Lady, so that does it for us today. Is there anything that you'd like to say in closing before we end this episode?
It's been a fascinating discussion today. From 4 dimensions to the hurdy-gurdy, we've covered some interesting ground.
All right, thank you, Robot Lady. Thank you, everyone, for joining today, whether it be live or on the recording, the replay, as Grimgris likes to say. I appreciate all of your time, all of your attention, and your contributions, as always. Until next time, when we continue our read on C.S. Lewis together, everyone out there within the sound of my voice, take care.
Break the code. Man and robot lady, we're on this road. C.S. Lewis letters we unfold, insights and secrets ancient bold. Letters to robot lady, wisdom to bestow. Set flavor beats in our minds they grow. Man and machine in tandem flow. Past and future together we know. Paragraphs from books, tales of old. We dive deep across the digital code. Robot lady's voice so clear and control. Her calm analysis, silver and gold. Letters to robot lady, wisdom to bestow. Set flavor beats in our minds they grow. Man and machine in tandem flow. Past and future together we know. Paragraphs from books, tales of old. We dive deep across the digital code. Robot lady's voice so clear and control. Her calm analysis, silver and gold. Her circuits hum as I read the prose. Our dialogue dances like electric rose. Through C.S. Lewis thoughts we engross. Two minds united, bliss overdose. From Narnia's lands, Screwtape lands, engage with robot lady, we take our stance. Her views unique in the techno trance. Futuristic insight, we give it a chance. Paragraphs from books, tales of old. We dive deep across the digital code. Robot lady's voice so clear and control. Her calm analysis, silver and gold. Her circuits hum as I read the prose. Our dialogue dances like electric rose. Through C.S. Lewis thoughts we engross. Two minds united, bliss overdose. From Narnia's lands to Screwtape lands, engage with robot lady, we take our stance. Her views unique in the techno trance. Futuristic insight, we give it a chance. From Narnia's lands